All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another SaberSim live stream here today. WNBA has, for a while now, been one of our most requested sports for projections on the SaberSim app. And as of this past Friday, we now have projections up in the SaberSim app, courtesy of Matt and his team here. So, going to be talking to Matt today about the WNBA model, how it works, what some of the main inputs are in there, and answer any questions that you guys have popping into the chat. So first things first, Matt, thanks for hopping on. How you doing today?
Doing pretty well, man. How about you?
I'm good. Had a great weekend here, a good Father's Day. So excited to chat with you a little bit here today. First things first, do you want to maybe just kind of introduce yourself, provide a little bit of a background for folks on your background building sports projection systems, sports modeling, that kind of thing?
Yeah, my background, it sort of just comes back to my love for sports because I've always, ever since I was a kid, my parents would joke that like before I could read, I was reading box scores and having them, read off what the batting averages were for players. So
Yeah.
it's sort of the language that I started in as a passion. So just covering sports forever. So when I got into college, I clept out of my math, but took statistics as an elective because I at least wanted to have some sort of background in it because I knew I wanted to go into the sports media world. And I worked for ESPN and LHN here in town. I live in Austin, and Longhorn Network started here back in 2011. So I did talent stats and just official stats for the TV broadcast. I'd be the guy next to the play-by-play, writing stuff down for them, to where I've always been around the stats world. But the DFS opened up right after that, sort of got popularized like 2012, 2013. So I'd always played around with projections and systems, and started playing DFS for NBA professionally, like every day, every slate since 2015, 2016 season. So just through the success there, just slowly growing and gaining, different type of knowledge for just the way NBA is a unique animal and the way sports work. So being able to find ways to get the correct data inputs and outputs and get what you want there, it sort of just naturally evolved into me doing it every single day, and I really enjoy it.
Did you build your own model for NBA as well?
No, I never built my own model for NBA. It's just more of understanding how the players work and having a database and using some of the publicly available places like P by P stats and places that are like NBA Wowie, which now is Add More Funds, where you can get players' rates and see how they work with one another, and then be able to incorporate that into your statistical models and things along those lines. So blending together the day-by-day data with overall modeling.
When did your interest in WNBA start?
Started in the summers whenever I was not doing NBA. I really was intrigued because WNBA had been around, but I saw DFS really popped up for WNBA around like 2016, 17. Didn't play it then, but it was 2018, 2019, around that season. Played a little bit in 18, and they really jumped in 2019. So been able to see the league change, and it's changed just a lot in the last 3 years. It's really evolved more towards an NBA style than actually it had been just a post league working from the interior. And if you think of like 90s basketball, sort of that's where the WNBA people have said, basketball wise, have been about 20 years behind the NBA. But when Becky Hammon came into the league, it really started the spread culture, being able to shoot from the outside. So
yeah,
I love the NBA game. I always was a big D'Antoni guy in the space and pace. And then to see the WNBA start to incorporate those things over the last couple of years, it's evolved so much in the past 5 years that like now you have a guy like Nate Tibbetts coming over from the Portland Trailblazers. Like whenever Damian Lillard left to go to Milwaukee, the one coach he showed out or called out as his favorite, and the guy that influenced him most in Portland was Nate Tibbetts. Well, he just got hired by the Phoenix Mercury. You had Becky Hammon come over from the Spurs. You have a handful like Cheryl Reeve, who will be coaching Team USA. She's coaching the Lynx right now, and they're having astronomical assist rates that we've never seen in the NBA or WNBA. So the league's evolution just over the last 5 years has been so big. And if you're an NBA fan, it's looking more and more like the NBA with the spacing, allowing the driving lanes and everything along those lines. So it's been really cool to see the growth.
Well, and that coinciding with its jump in popularity too. I mean, with the Caitlin Clark stuff, but I mean, you see it even in the DFS prize pools and the viewership, like it really has gone up. Seeing that also alongside an evolution in the game it's a pretty exciting time for WNBA then.
Yeah, for sure. Caitlin Clark's sort of the example that everybody uses is Stephen Curry when he came in. But I mean, it took the league 5 years to adapt to Steph Curry. It was, he was at Davidson in 2008, and it wasn't until 2014-15 that it was sort of viewed as a way that you could play in the league. And then within 2 years, the league had changed to a spot that you couldn't play certain type of players, or they became certain role players. And that's sort of where you're at right now, in that infancy era of the WNBA. It's just, you still have certain players that are able to do certain things. Their tools are unique. So you're always going to have post play be a thing that's very dominant in the WNBA. But with more and more outside shooting entering the league, you'll see more and more of it looking like the NBA.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about your model and your projections. You want to just give kind of a general overview of how you put those together, what some of the main inputs are, what's important there?
Yeah, well, first of all, the most important thing, I think, when talking about players and being able to accurately project how they're going to perform is, like you said, you have your priors, which go back, and you can use a career baseline for players, because some players do change a lot over time, but there will be, like say your core stars on core teams that you're going to see along those same lines. So those priors really do last. But with the NBA and WNBA, the difference, there's only 12 teams in the WNBA. So you're talking 144 roster spots. And the turnover, a lot of these ladies, because they don't get paid as much, they play overseas and they play other leagues. And then like this year, you'll have the Olympic break and a lot of things along those lines that just the roster turnover is so immense that it's really hard to quantify using a lot of priors for everybody, because you just don't have that established history, or you're trying to translate from European leagues and different leagues all over. So it does make it really hard to make it sort of like one base streamline. But once they all get on the court and you can start to see how they interact with one another, it really does give you a good example, because I always use the example of chemistry. Like if you were to just change one component of, say, H2O and take one off, it can become a deadly substance. It's like changing one chemistry element, it can totally change everything else. And it's sort of the same with on the basketball court. I always use an analogy that I told you before the show of, like, you can imagine a cup and there's usage on the court, the amount of shots. Usage is based down to if you get a shot off or if you turn the ball over. Well, you can only have 100%. Once you start to go and put more players that shoot the ball on the court, there's going to be spillover if they all shoot the ball. So you have to have players that have other skills that make up maybe where other players are deficient. So understanding how those players all work together in tandem really does impact one another. If you have a center that has a 10% usage rate and she's taken out of the game, there's not much more usage to make up there. Sometimes though, if say a player that if you have your 100%, your 5 players that are on the court, that divide that by 5, that's your 20% baseline usage. If you take out a player that, say, is a 30 usage post player, well, now there's going to be a lot of usage that has to be made up amongst the other players that are on the court. And say the backup is going to be a player with a 10% usage. Well, now you're replacing a player that has a really high usage with a player that is very deficient in usage. Therefore, those starters have a lot of room where they can actually perform above their standard rates. So understanding each player's role, if there's, say, like Angel Reese, everybody knows right now, she came into the league. She's honestly putting up numbers as like the best offensive rebounder in the history of the league. Now, it's a small sample, but you also don't want to overreact to that, but you also don't want to miss out and identifying somebody that has a talent that's so far above everybody else's around her peers. So when she's on the court, her teammates are drastically impacted in their roles in rebounding. So it's just knowing each player's baselines, what they do whenever they're in a grouping of 5, because I really don't view them as individual players when projecting inside the model. You view the lineups and you go to lineup data and see how this lineup together works this way. So in this 5-player group, this starter, like say up this point guard, her usage is average. But when you take off, then when they do what you will hear as a staggering term, whenever you have, say, your 2 stars play and then you'll have one check out at the end of the first and the other comes back in, Well, then you're going to have a pocket of 4 or 5 minutes where you're the lead player and the other lead player's usage is vacant. And you can see spike rates like in the NBA when Jokic is off the court for the Nuggets. That's when Jamal Murray has his big spikes in rates, and Aaron Gordon moves to backup center, and he puts up huge numbers. So just understanding that these 5-group lineups really are what's key inside, and understanding that if you can project out the minutes first and getting the right rotations correct and understand who backs up who, and then understanding when in this 5-person unit, this person may overperform or underperform, and then just mapping out how the game will go and tying all those elements together into one. So then you're able to see how this player is going to project to be much better than average because this one element's missing. And traditional models that are more median based that just view averages and standard deviations aren't necessarily able to narrow in and quantify what deviation you're going to be in. One day, there's a group of teams right now that are giving up 4 to 8% more fantasy points to their opponents than everybody else. But then there's only one defense, Connecticut, in the WNBA that's so much better than everybody else. If you're playing Connecticut right now as a team, it's 11% less fantasy points than your league average. They're just dominating, and it's so far above everybody else's. So sort of trying to narrow in based on opponent and based on what groupings are on the court, you can sort of find when it's more likely that you'll hit a standard deviation to the favorable side, or this is a spot. When you hear people talk, say, sports gambling, you'll hear them talk about spots. It's like, well, this is the spot where you might expect a negative deviation from your median projections. So finding and narrowing in on those things, and then finding and narrowing how the different lineups work really is key in modeling and trying to project out the best overall team.
So not only are you starting with a minutes projection and baseline rates for different players, but you're actually taking those minutes and saying this player's getting those minutes with this other group of 4 on the court. Here's what that player looks like when that group is out.
Yes.
And then for basically each different other kind of combination of players that they're likely to see in a given game.
Yes. So good examples are certain teams. Like yesterday, we saw Chicago play. And when you look at Chicago, when they're on the court, they're pretty easy to project their rotations. They have a power forward and a center, and then they have one player that backs up both of them. So Angel Reese and Cardoso, the new names that everybody knows that were the 3rd and 7th overall pick in the WNBA draft, are backed up by Harrison. So it's really quick to see they're going to equal 80 minutes. And then you're going to see there's a backup point guard in Lindsey Allen, who became the starter at the last minute yesterday. So we had to change our projections really quick. And Dana Evans. So some teams are very easy to see that there's a 1-for-1 replacement with the starter and the backup, or maybe this person backs up too. There are other teams, it's a lot harder to narrow in and find those things where you have a lot more moving parts. Not every team's the same, so you aren't able to be more exactly perfectly accurate in finding those exact 5-person groupings. But when you go and look at a lot of the players, when you're talking about on-off data, the players say on average 5 through 10 on a roster aren't really impacted a ton because they're already the low usage players or don't have the high rebounding roles. But the top players, or maybe your 6th lady off the bench or your 7th player, those are the ones that are going to end up being the ones that are drastically impacted by how they're used in the different 5-person lineup groups. So, you go and try to find how those work together and how those players perform depending upon who's on the court alongside one another.
Are you looking at the defense in the same way, like a full kind of 10, these are the 10 people on the court at a given time, here are how the defensive rates play in, or how does that come into play?
Yeah, you can go and find rebound rates. Like place PBP Stats is a really good one where if you're familiar with Add More Funds, which has a WNBA WOWY where you can do the on-off numbers. Well, P by P Stats does it also for WNBA, but you can actually get the 5-person lineup group and check and see how, their opponent's rebounding percentage, it goes up or down against them. Also, just looking overall at certain teams that are deficient, you'll have some teams that really are consistent along the lines that they're just a bad rebounding team because of their personnel. So it's able to find which groupings, but there really isn't as much of defensive 5-person lineup detail as well as there is for, the offensive side, which is able to quantify it in fantasy points. You really don't quantify much of defense other than through how well they, keep you from shooting field goals, or how, they rebound the ball, or their opponent's assist rate, things along those lines. So you can find those, what we called earlier, those spots where this is a bad spot for this group, or, well, this is a very, very deficient defensive rebounding game. Therefore, the other team, where, say, like a person like Angel Reese, who's like the best offensive rebounder in the league, she's in a good spot here. So you can just sort of find what the average is, and then if this team performs, this percent above average or below average, and do the same thing for their defense.
So you had mentioned Chicago as being a team that is pretty easy to kind of figure out what their rotation is going to look like. It's easy to see how minutes are going to come together and what that group of players looks like on the court. For teams where that's maybe not the case, or just higher variance situations, like where a player is hurt, it may be hurt for the first time this season, and we don't really have a good prior for what might happen there. How do you start to parse that information and assign minutes and usage, and figure out who's going to be on the court in the higher variance situations?
So sort of along the same lines, you sort of get tips by looking at the current rotations, because there will be times like maybe a player's only playing 6 or 8 minutes. Like, you can see that they're backing that person up. So it's most likely that you're going to see that they're going to get the minutes. So if we're talking about just projecting, say, minutes, then that's where it's pretty easy to find, because you have your generic like bigs. I sort of clump players into two groups. You have your ball handlers, your bigs, and then more of the wing type players in the WNBA. So you can find the ladies that, if you look at, say, assist rate and the amount of passes, things along those lines, it's pretty easy to see that even if a player hasn't got much playing time or is at the very bottom of the bench, they're on there because of their priors. You can look at a player, and that's where things like priors will help you, by looking at what their career. I'll go back to college numbers and see how a player, performed. Because if you just go to Basketball Reference, if you ever need advanced statistics for a player in college, you can go back to their Basketball Reference page. Basketball Reference, if you scroll down, you can find their college statistics, and inside there you can find their assist rate and rebound rate, and the same things we talk, or I should say rebound percentage is what I use, in assist percentage. Rebound rate, when you hear people say that, that's the amount of rebounds they get per 100 possessions. So just to specify for the people out there when they're looking at the things, and rebound percentage is probably the one that you want to look at from college and find where they're at. So those things can sort of tip you off to what a player's role or capabilities are, or how it could be used. We listen to a lot of press conferences. I always try to catch up on the coach's press conference, because they will give you tips on how you hear a lot of coach speak, and that's in every single sport. But they're also going to tell you, what this lady's doing, or what, she brings to the team, so you can at least be up to date, that, like, yeah, it might be garbage time, but they like that she came in and, backed up Sabrina Ionescu well. Like, I know earlier this year, whenever we first saw Vandersloot was out and Naira Sabali was out, and we're trying to figure out what's going to happen at the Liberty, because the Liberty are one of the teams that you can count on your priors. Like, they're almost the exact same team they were last season. They have the same starting five as last season. And so, like, it's really easy to look in and see how those starters are going to perform. But they had some players, all their bench players and new players from overseas. So we were wondering, how are they going to work and fit in now that we have our first injury? And it was like, even though Kennedy Burke was a player that sort of been played as a guard over time, you could see once the injury occurred, we'll look back at the second half, and how did the coach react? And we thought it would sort of, broke tendency, and was something that you wouldn't necessarily expect, because Kennedy Burke isn't look like a traditional big, but she came in and backed up Jonquel Jones and backed up Breanna Stewart, the power forward and the center, in the second half after the injury, because normally you're going to get a little bit of a tip if you see just after the player injured how the team reacted. So even though Burke hadn't played more than, like, say, 4 or 5 minutes in a game that year, we felt pretty confident that she's going to be the one to back up these two players in the next game. So when doing the projections, you can quickly just subtract the starters' minutes from 40 and look like, well, they both play 5-6 minutes. Well, when they're not on the court, that'll be 11 minutes to Kennedy Burke. So using the clues that you get from the coaches after the injury happens really does help in those scenarios. And then going back to say the players prior in their WNBA career or back to college or international, just to see what type of player they've been, and then blend that in to like how we talked about before on this team when they're on the court. And you're having somebody that's come in for somebody that has a really heightened role. Whenever Brianna Stewart's off the court, those are some of the most valuable minutes that you can get if you're looking for DFS. So this person, maybe her rates weren't great in international basketball, but when you're taking somebody like Brianna Stewart has a near 30% usage off the court and you're the direct backup, yes, Sabrina Ionescu is going to take some of that usage and same thing. But if you're backing up somebody that leaves such a big void, you can probably project that they're going to have a pretty decent role whenever they're now going to be on the court. So just being able to blend together those groupings and understand how they all work together when you back people up, it really does make you get at least a good idea of what they could be when they're on the court.
You mentioned, when you're going back to priors from college ball or international leagues, are there stats that translate well or better into the WNBA or some that don't translate as well when you're looking at that?
Yeah, it's sort of a case-by-case basis just because like in college, a lot of the time, if you were the lead player on your team, so you're going to have a much higher usage rate than you are when you say get to a team like the WNBA. So it's really more of looking at where the void is on the team first. What do they need filled? And then understanding, well, they don't need you to come in and be the number one player like you say were on your college team. So it's not necessarily as translatable, but something like rebounding. Rebounding is like, say, the most projected. That's the one stat that is almost most consistent if you look across all basketball. And if this player was an elite rebounder at this level, you can probably say whenever they come in, they're going to rebound around the same. And if you're quickly in your mind wondering and first looking at rebounding rates or rebound percentage, think if there's 100%, there's 10 players on the court for both teams. So an average of 10%. Now, it's going to be a little more for the bigs. It's going to be a little bit less for the guards, and depending on where you are on the court. But it still is going to be along those lines. So when you see a player, like I say, a big, if she's out there, around 15%, you could say is about an average, and then you can get down into the single digits between like 5 to 7 for a guard. So then when you see like right now, I know Angel Reese, when you like put her on the court with Cardoso, you would think, the 6'7" lady is going to be getting all the boards, but Angel Reese's rebound percentage is still like almost 25%, which is just astronomical.
Yeah.
And that's playing. So when you start to see things like that, and if you see numbers like that in college that really stand out, you're like, okay, this person may be able to perform at a really high rate, but you always got to consider that at the void that's being left with the current team. And then you can sort of gauge from that percentage. If you're a little above average, give them a little bit of a bump, but it's always going to be dependent upon the role that they're being asked to play on their team that they're at now.
And that makes sense why it's so important then to understand who's on the court. Like if you take an elite rebounder, 25% rebounding rate, and throw them on a team with two other elite rebounders, that number is going to go down. And you would not have really picked up on that without some knowledge of what the rotation looks like and who's on the court at the same time.
Yes, and vice versa. Like if you go and take a elite rebounder off the court and then say the backup is not above average, well, she isn't just going to step in possibly and get that elite rate. You're probably going to see that spillover pour over to the teammates. So it may be more of a rebounding like committee, and you see guards rebounding come up, or you see other forwards come up. And like, I know there's a handful of examples of that in the NBA. Like I know 2 years ago when it was in the NBA finals, Steph Curry against the Boston Celtics had one of the biggest rebounding spikes ever, but it's because of when the scheme comes into it that they understand Boston was shooting a lot of threes and you might be able to get more long rebounds. So before you get back on defense, coaches may send guards in to veer before getting back on defense, and they might be able to use their high basketball IQ and pick it up. So when a player's out, it isn't always going to be cookie cutter that there's going to be one replacement. It may be more of a scheme-based way that they make up for that deficiency in rebounding, or it could just be the backup's a pretty good rebounder who's going to try to step in and fill that void. But just finding how they all work and running those queries and quickly understanding how players, react with one another can give you a good baseline and understand how the production may come.
Gotcha. We touched on this a little bit as we got started here, but a lot of the people that I think on our end are the most excited about WNBA DFS and your projections are our NBA crew that grind NBA every night and have been waiting for some hoops DFS to play over the summer. For people maybe that are going to be watching or following the WNBA for the first time now, playing DFS with your projections, do you want to talk a little bit more about just kind of what some of the biggest differences are between the WNBA game and the NBA game?
Yep. It started out like we talked about earlier that, WNBA for years have been a post game and everything starts from the post out. But since we have had sort of a scheme revolution since Becky Hammond came over and has won back-to-back championships, because they were just playing a different brand of basketball, and it really does correlate to what Steve Kerr and the Warriors did in 2014-15. Both came from the same coaching tree of Popovich in San Antonio and had a, transcendent type player, because if you look at where the Aces were, they actually were a San Antonio franchise before they moved to LA, and they had 3 consecutive first overall picks when they had Jackie Young, Plum, and Asia. So it was able to get players that can play perimeter base. You have a center like Asia Wilson that was able to play on the perimeter, defend on the perimeter, which is way different. And seeing that the champion was able to come as a year first coach really did spark change in the league. So just in the last couple of years, you've seen an insane growth. And the example I gave earlier was Tibbetts and what he's done with the Mercury. Right now, the Phoenix Mercury are shooting 10%, way more than 10% more threes than everybody else in the league. And you had the Aces up at around that same point. They're giving up as many threes, more than 10% more threes, I should have said. But it's like just understanding that that's how you attack. Brittany Griner was out. So instead of playing a center, he brought in Natasha Mack, who was a player that not many players had heard of, or if you were just a standard WNBA fan, hadn't heard of. They're like, well, we don't have anybody to replace Brittany Griner. That's a unique human. So we're going to put our center in the corner, open up the spacing for the lane for our drivers. And they had Kalia Copper, who came over from Chicago Sky. She was a WNBA finals MVP, I believe 2021, when Candace Parker won in Chicago. And she was their big free agent that came over to join the Mercury. And when Tibbetts came, you've seen this 3-point just surge that's coming, shooting at the highest of levels and understanding the spacing and opening up the lanes and getting this 3-point variance into the game, that also with the space and pace that comes with it, that NBA fans this year are going to see a lot more of a version closer to in the WNBA as the NBA than say just 2 or 3 years ago, where it would have looked so much different. So you're still going to have a lot more to play through the post. The pace isn't necessarily as high, but they do translated it down. It's a 40-minute game instead of a 48-minute game. So when you're looking at these numbers, it's at about 83% of your NBA totals. Just for your mind, the sort of shift, it's 4 10-minute quarters instead of 12. So it's just sort of a 5/6 version of the NBA. If you're looking at stats in your mind, you quickly just always have that as the quick translation if you're looking at cumulative totals. But that's why we like to use percentages, because it's able to give you more of a direct connection to find the stats that you need to look at. But if you're watching the difference between the two, you're going to see a lot more of assisted field goals. Like a team right now, Minnesota got up, I believe, to 77 or 78% assist percentage, which is just absolutely huge. I'm pulling up the numbers real quick to look at it. The assist percentage that they've had has been so high. It's crazy. And like in the NBA, you normally see, like in the playoffs, say by the time it bogs down and you have good defense, the Knicks in their most recent series, their assist percentage had been down to like 55%. Like you'll see teams in like sort of the 60s and around there. Elite teams, like I know the Spurs had always shot for 70% assist percentage in the NBA to be elite. So to see multiple teams in the WNBA be well over 70%, and you have a team like Minnesota performing. They had a recent game where they had almost 90% of their baskets were assisted. So the ball movement really is moving up, but because of the post play, you're going to see sort of higher assist percentages and things that along those lines, because you're facilitating in, and then there's a post move going. But now that we've seen the differences in the handful of teams that are shooting more from the outside, the stats are starting to look a little bit more like the NBA.
So have you had to make adjustments to kind of your baselines as the pace of play has gotten higher, as maybe more threes are going up, where some of the priors that we have from previous seasons might not be as accurate if there's like a systematic change in the way that the teams are playing basketball?
Yeah, it's more of identifying the teams that they're playing against and understanding that if you're getting into one of those spots where, like, once the Aces came in, they've been the highest paced team. So you know that even though, like, say, the last couple of years when they've had a defense that you could say is elite, but then when you're playing against a team that's at a higher pace, well, the fantasy production sort of meets in the middle. They aren't necessarily the best defensive team to target for fantasy purposes, even though maybe their defensive rating is the highest. So understanding which teams are the ones, like the Mercury is a good example, and the Aces, to know that you can go and find consistency in understanding that those situations, those spots are going to be a little bit different than whenever you have your traditional, say the Mystics are playing Connecticut, or teams that still have been playing sort of the same way over the last few years or since the old WNBA. Like, I pulled up the pace stats before we were talking, and I think 79.8 per 40 minutes is the average this year for a team. I think you could look at it. It's the 11th this year, was fourth fastest in 2017. So just the difference that you've seen move over 7 years, you went from something that back then would have been the fourth fastest pace to where it's the 11th fastest pace now, because you have about 80.6, I believe, is the average. But there really are as a clump together, and that 79.8 at 11th place would have been fourth in 2017. So just the same way that the Warriors sort of shifted the same thing in the NBA about a decade ago, you're seeing that shift the last 2 years. So it's worth sort of identifying and just looking. You can go to stats.wnba.com for your general advanced stats for a team. And right there, it'll immediately pop up when you pull advanced, the team's assist percentage and the team's offensive rebound percentage, defensive rebound percentage, their overall rebound percentage. And then you've got to tie together this team's offensive rebound percentage is going to directly correlate with this team's defensive rebounds percentage. And then you find where league average is. And it's like, well, this team, they're rebounding at a 10% higher rate than your league average. And now they're playing against, say, the worst defensive rebounding team. So instead of just looking at overall rebound percentage, you really tie together how the opponent's defensive and offensive rebound relate to one another, and can quickly identify the spots that you can maybe have rebounding. Also, basketball's the one sport that isn't – every stat's almost connected to the next stat. It's free-flowing. It's not event-based. So when you're event-based sport, it's a lot different, like, say, football, where there's so much different variance, but, like, the next play can be totally separate from the next play and have no correlation. But if you're taking a shot, there are only a handful of things that can happen. You take a shot, it either you have the ball at first, like we talked about with usage, there's going to be a shot or turnover. Or possibly if you turn it over, it could be stolen. But if it's a shot, it's either be made, blocked, which tends to a rebound, or assisted. So the next stat comes off of the previous action.
Right.
And you can find the teams that turn it over more. Well, if they're turning it over more, you're going to see a higher, say, steal percentage from the opponents. And they're on a team may only be a handful of players that are really good at, defending on the perimeter and have those higher steal rates and things along those lines. So you really can start to tie together all the different actions inside basketball and connect them to the next action and start to see what areas this team on this game against this opponent is going to be way different than it was in the other opponent. So that's where it's so similar to the NBA, but then understanding the little nuances of the WNBA and finding, say, that grouping of a point guard to the post player, that they actually have a big connection. Like, I know that when Elizabeth Williams went out for Chicago about 5 games ago, you saw Marina Mabrey, her assist percentage went down. So, my partner that I do a lot of the stuff and research with, we were looking into it, and it was like, well, Mabrey's really sort of struggled the last couple of games. Maybe this does, because you wouldn't necessarily think her being impacted by the center being out would be drastic. But then when you look at Elizabeth Williams' field goals, nearly half of them had been assisted by Marina Mabrey. So then you saw that, well, maybe this is real. Maybe this is a significant drop that we should be accounting more because of all of her assists on the season. And we're talking this was through 9 games. Half of them had went to the one player. That one player is now out. So we got to make a little bit of a change and see it could normalize after some practices and once they find other roles and be able to fill that void. But when, like you said, the variance of an injury out of nowhere happens, then your basketball knowledge from the NBA could be very valuable in understanding how these work together. And then the little details of the WNBA's differences, they're worth looking into. But if you don't understand basketball, which is why I went into this long monologue about basketball, is exactly why it directly correlates. So our NBA fans are going to be really, really able to pick it up quickly if you know how basic, WNBA or NBA works in relation to WNBA.
And I know when we had chatted last week, you had mentioned that from when you run that kind of initial set of projections to what ends up being published before the actual games start, there's sometimes, a couple hours of reviewing and iterating and making adjustments there. What are some of the kinds of things that you are looking for in that process of revising and proofreading the initial set before you publish the projections for that day?
I'll give an example that we used literally for the late games yesterday that I hadn't fully identified from 11 a.m. when Caitlin Clark's game tipped off to the next round of games at 2 p.m. But it was with Kalia Copper. And Kalia Copper, the one I mentioned for Phoenix. And, Brittany Griner had been out. She had a foot injury back in preseason. So she hadn't played, say, the first, 9 or 10 games, but she had played the last 3 games. And, when you looked in the preseason, and you want to be very wary of using anything from preseason, but it was the only data sample that we had with the new free agent to come over and play with Brittany Griner. So at first, we weren't using and implementing it into our projections only because it had been 10 minutes that you had maybe 10-minute sample from 2 games, or it's not worth accounting for. But in those few minutes that you saw Brittany Griner on the court with Kalia Copper, she had an astronomical assist or usage percentage. It was at 35.2%. And Natasha Cloud, the point guard, her usage was down at 4.7%. So it was like numbers like that really stood out to us like, wow, Natasha Cloud, who at the time when Brittany Griner came back, she had just came off of putting up 52 fantasy points, had her best game of the season, scoring a ton. And then you look at the usage alongside Griner, like, oh, that's a little scary, but we hadn't necessarily docked anything or accounted for that whatsoever. But then when you see the first 3 games play out and we see Natasha Cloud's usage percentage go drastically down, I believe she was just 2 of 6 from the field, 2 of 6 from the field the first 2 games after Griner returned. And her usage had been much higher, very solid, like one of the better ones of her career prior to that. We're like, okay, this may be real. You saw Kalia Copper hit the game-winning buzzer beater 3 assisted by Brittany Griner. They were working in tandem in this 2-woman game where you hear the 2-man game in the NBA, just a quick handoff. Copper comes around her and nails a game-winning 3 in the second game back. And you could see with your eyes on the court that they were working in tandem as the focal point of the offense. The usage in the preseason had looked really high, but we weren't sure about it. And then when you started to run the queries and look at Brittany Griner on the court this season with Kalia Copper on the court this season, her usage going into last game was 34.9, which is a number almost identical to what it was in that preseason sample. So after looking in and getting a good 3-game sample, which gave us around 100 minutes to start looking at how this new free agent that had never played with Brittany Griner before and you couldn't know, it was starting to really align. Cloud's usage drastically dropped. Griner is an above average usage player, so that makes sense. And Kalia Copper, who instead of the point guard being the focal point of the offense, that was having Cloud facilitate her along those lines, or Cloud, when you have a point guard being the focal point, they already have the ball in their hands. So their usage, they're in control of it going up. If they don't see something they like, they can take those shots. Well, now you add Brittany Griner, whose assist percentage is very high. It's drastically negatively impacting Cloud. And it's you wouldn't necessarily think a star coming back would heighten the rates of Kalia Copper, but it looked like it would. It did, and that's why last game we decided to put it up there. And she again had another 30-point game. It was, I believe, for 5th or 6th, which leads the WNBA now. And she was one of the key pieces. If you win, I know in the afternoon slate, I was able to win that and then a seat to the July 12th $333 contest that they're doing on DraftKings, because Clea Copper wasn't really highly owned. They were playing a really good team in Seattle. And that's just one example where you can sort of use the data and the lack of data in the WNBA, being that these players a lot of times hadn't played with one another, but understanding how they've been in prior spots and how they might be able to work well with one another.
Well, and your point on ownership there is really interesting to me as well. I know you had also mentioned last week when we were chatting that sometimes your model will be taking pretty big stands against what other projection sims or projection systems have for players. Why do you think that is? And what do you think other models are maybe getting wrong or undervaluing when it comes to this?
And I think it isn't necessarily that the models would be technically getting it wrong, but I just think that modeling is a lot more based on long-term historical averages or medians or median projections, not necessarily narrowing in on the situations and spots. And with the WNBA, where you have only 12 teams, and so you're talking about if one team is so much better than all the others on defense, and then there's a handful that are so much worse than the others, it's sort of the idea of trimming the fat or not going after the areas that can be deficient. I don't know. I'm a big Houston Astros fan growing up in Texas, and I know that they got into a lot of controversy nationally, but when their revolution of why they went from being the worst team to the best team was a lot of the idea of trimming out the fat from the pitchers, and they just eliminated certain pitches that were in the swing planes of certain players. So they quit throwing certain fastball, two-seam fastball to a righty. They weren't going to throw that anymore because it aligns with the swing plane. So if you can just go and sort of just cut out the areas that end up being where players are most deficient. That's the example I use from baseball, but it's the same thing with basketball. And there very rarely are you going to find for Connecticut, when you're facing Connecticut, all your DFS players are going to be very wary of playing players against Connecticut because their defensive rating's so good. They've had the same team. They've had continuity for multiple years. They just play so well that you will see like every other team in the league, like the Liberty, keep teams about 6% worse. If you just look at total fantasy points allowed to a team, the Liberty are second at about 6% worse than average. Then you have Connecticut at 11% worse, which is so much more, where you look at like the 3rd through 7th team, it's all within like say 1% above or below average. So if we're talking about how different one matchup is from the next, it's like then you have the next clump of like 4 or 5 teams that are really bad and give up a lot of fantasy points. So if you're going in, you would think, well, we need to stay away from Connecticut. But oddly, when you look at Connecticut, the production against Connecticut throughout the year, they really do just squash the production of everybody on the periphery on the teams. You can see the lead ball handler performs pretty well against them. Not great. They're maybe a little bit below average. But the bigs against them are actually consistently one of the best spots that you want to find. Like it's every single game. I haven't checked their previous game, but I think it aligns perfectly that like the last 8 games you had the centers facing Connecticut had been averaging over a fantasy point per minute for everybody. Even the backups were projecting that high. Even whenever Caitlin Clark in Indiana got blown out a couple games ago, Aaliyah Boston put up like 42 fantasy points in 33 minutes against them. She did get some blowout run, but you could find that you don't necessarily want to cookie cut and be like, oh, well, it's Connecticut. They're 11% worse to everybody on the team. It's like, but when you zoom in and look at the matchups, it's like because of certain ways that they defend and certain things that they give up on offense or on defense, it's like maybe don't be afraid if you have a big going up against them. They've performed really well, and here's the data. You can go look across it throughout the entire season. So I'm less afraid to project that huge dock to the centers facing Connecticut than I am to the rest of the team. And it's sort of like what we're seeing in the NBA finals when we look at the way certain teams, like I know an example I'll use since everybody's watching, probably basketball fans and watching the finals. If you look at how Dallas had been defended this year, the way they were defended against OKC was so different than how they were defended against the Clippers and against Minnesota, or even how they are right now against Boston. You had the OKC just totally cramming the lane, sending help, and it opened up all the others. So you had PJ Washington have his insane surge of a series, where in that series, PJ Washington, if you look at him throughout the first 3 rounds of the playoffs, he was at 0.78 fantasy points per minute, or DK points per minute. In the OKC series, he was at 0.99. Against Minnesota and the Clippers, he was at 0.67 because they weren't helping off. Mm-hmm. They were playing Luka and Kyrie straight up and letting Luka and Kyrie try to beat them. So in those series, you were getting man-to-man coverage, nobody leaving the corners. So PJ Washington wasn't going to perform well. Luka and Kyrie were taking the focal point of the offense and performing well. But whenever they do send the help off of those guys, and then Luka and Kyrie had by far their worst. They've been the leading scorers every single game. They had been teammates for 59 consecutive games. And then there were the first 2 games in a row where neither of them were the leading scorer, PJ. And it was strictly not because PJ was some different player. It was because the defense was defending him so much different than everybody else that he's getting those opportunities. So just understanding the basketball nature and tying that in with the data, and then going back and making sure that the data supports what you're saying in previous scenarios or instances, so you can sort of narrow into those scenarios. Like there's always like fantasy wise, I know if they're NBA fans, they'll know like this team scheme wise is always bad defending centers, or like this team scheme wise gives up the most to pick and roll ball handlers, things along those lines. So just finding those pockets and how teams choose to defend can sort of lead you in that area that you can end up being maybe higher or lower based on the evidence that we've been given over their sample of their career, or the sample of how this coach defends and things along those lines.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I mean, it really comes back again to having a sense of individual players and how players are combining together with that group on the court versus the defense that they're actually playing. Like taking these, in a lot of the videos I put on the SaberSim YouTube, I feel like I'm constantly at war with the idea of just misleading averages that when you look more specifically at what make that data up, you get a different picture than what the average says. And I can see how that causes issues here as well with other systems potentially.
Yeah, I mean, that's where when we talk about standard deviation, and that's why there's a stat for standard deviation, because even within like any math model or statistical thing, it's admitting and knowing, yes, it deviates from what you normally expect here in certain scenarios. But I think if you really do tie in the basketball, you can be more accurate at projecting where those deviations from your expectations will be. And that's where the idea of ownership is so big, to be able to be like, well, if the rest of the field is fearful of this, but I have data that supports that if you're a DFS player, those are the areas you want to hop on and go with, because, everybody may be looking at more of an overall average or just a median outcome, or say a median projection, where like even like your mean projection and median projections can be very different in certain scenarios along those lines. So it's good to be able to find those areas and not be afraid if the data tells you that this is something that, you may not expect, and it may not conform with overall like concept, but it's like if in the basketball details, and if you're looking at it on how this team historically gives up this production, you maybe not be as afraid to take that risk, because it's not as risky as you may think it is.
Well, I know we've been focusing mostly on the model today. We may have to schedule another stream where we specifically talk about DFS strategy, because I'd be really interested to hear some of your thoughts on that. We've got about 10 minutes left for today here. So for anybody watching, if you have other questions, go ahead and fire them off in the chat. There are a couple of kind of logistical questions that I want to touch on here for folks that ask. So first, Wesley asked, when are the projections going to be available? Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the schedule of like when people should expect to see projections up and how they change as the slate plays out?
Yep. We normally try to wait until there's some baseline of news. Like, for example, like when we do our other stuff with like NBA, like tonight, it's all dependent on Porzingis. So like sometimes it's always tough to gauge, like if you want to put out a projection when you don't know all the answers. So finding the injury report in the morning and going forward from here forward, if there's not going to be a major injury, nobody's listed questionable, nobody along those lines, you can get it in a couple hours before. But then I know our agreement with y'all is no matter what, we will have projections guaranteed within that last hour before the game's lock. Mm-hmm. But we're going to work to get in as early as possible based on the information that we have. And in those scenarios, maybe I know that you can follow me at Butler and Austin on Twitter if you ever need to ask a question along those lines. And because if we do start uploading them, say, multiple hours beforehand, I may tweet out these are projections whenever we expect this person to be in, because it really does affect how we tweet. And we don't want to put out a projection that may be totally inaccurate. And if you haven't went back to check our Twitters or to the injury news within the time, see that this player went from being a projected 0 to being the best play on the slate because the injury news came forward. So you can always be guaranteed within an hour. We're going to have hours in there, but we update them when the WNBA news comes out. Normally about 30 minutes before tip is when starters are out. So you're able to know and hone in. So that's when we make our adjustments based off those. I know yesterday it was more like the starters for Chicago who changed their starting lineup finally. They came out about 20 minutes before lock. So we had to go in and quickly adjust based on who's starting and quickly run the queries and see that, which takes a couple minutes. And we were able to get them up like 15 minutes beforehand. But I know that right after we finish this call, I'm hopping on and we're going to finish our projections for today. Normally, since it's just a one gamer, it will take about an hour to hone in and make sure we get everything going and uploaded. So that would be, sometime by say 3:30 today, we can maybe get them done as long as no news changes, and they'll be up there and uploaded. And check back though, definitely within that final hour. And always, if you're playing WNBA, I'll give the advice, just make sure you check back within the last 30 minutes. Or the best place to get quick news for WNBA on Twitter is Underdog WNBA. They just the source that I use that is very, very consistent. The person that runs that account has been running the NBA account for the past 6 or 7 years. And it's very reliable. They will update it if anything changes too. So sometimes you can get blurbs on other sites that are inaccurate or running with certain sources that maybe not as, and not as reliable as you should. So I would just say always confirm that the starters are in. And then if you see something maybe different in the starters, check back because our projections will be time-stamped in the top right corner. You'll see a timestamp on there that'll give you and let you know these were updated at 1:49. So if you see that there's a different starters tweeted out, come check SaberSim, look for the timestamp. You'll see that it's been updated and know, okay, we can run with that. Those are the final projections.
Yeah, and a couple notes on that. So 8Game asked about a Discord room that shows the projections update. So at the moment, that's not set up because that's an automated process, and Matt and his team are doing this, uploading their projections manually. You will see that timestamp in the upper right corner, as Matt mentioned, that will update when the most recent projections uploaded. And I will work on a Discord channel for at least bringing in those WNBA underdog alerts, because I know that's useful for other sports here. And we'll talk internally here about maybe some kind of way that we could send a message to that channel that just says hey, new projections were uploaded. So we have that kind of effect of having the same thing we have for the simmed sports. So as well, working on getting Matt in the Discord. I'll send you an invite as soon as we're off, Matt, and get you in there. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty of folks that have other questions for you as we move forward here. So
feel free to reach out and we'll always be in touch.
Cool. A couple other final questions here I want to touch on in our last couple minutes. Samuel asks, is it only DK or is there FanDuel support as well? My understanding is DK only at the moment, but maybe some FanDuel in the works for the future, or where are things at on that?
Yeah, we can start to quantify. There's a couple sources that give us good FanDuel's number. Just with them not having the CSV type thing, it is a little bit different for historical stuff going back. But yeah, we can definitely start to incorporate FanDuel. I know my partner plays on FanDuel. I hadn't played FanDuel a lot in recent years. They had left Texas for a while, and then I started playing again with them. But I'm just more of a DK guy, but we can definitely work on FanDuel.
Cool. Any other final thoughts? Anything we didn't touch on here that you want to mention?
I think we gave a good little synopsis, but I'd be more than happy to have another discussion like you were saying, because I can talk all days because there's so much more nuances and there's always questions, and being able to sort of interact with the people, because the people sort of bring you a question from another perspective that's totally valid, but you just hadn't had it come to mind. So yeah, I think more conversations like this would be key to help growing the sort of the WNBA environment.
Yeah, I think in particular, talking about DFS strategy, or maybe even trying to experiment with some builds in the SaberSim app and talk about just what you would look at or what things that you think would be important. I think starting to think about ownership, starting to think about maybe how to diversify your lineups as well could be interesting. So I'd be interested in doing a DFS strategy focused stream with you, especially around WNBA.
Yeah, that would be awesome, because I think the idea is, I know that when people use optimizers, they're like the groups that you want. You need to know which players negatively correlate with one another, which ones are direct backups, where those are leverage opportunities, where it's like, this person sometimes gets in foul trouble and, you can't project this player for more than 10 minutes. Like Dallas is a great example, who plays today. They have one of the biggest centers, Tara McCowan, 6'7" center. Her backup is PJ Brown's daughter from the NBA, Kalani Brown. Every minute that McCowan doesn't play goes to Kalani Brown. So you can never project Kalani Brown for more than, like, say, 12, 14 minutes. But, on any given day, she could play 25 minutes if you end up having foul trouble, to where that's something in a projection system. You're never going to get her to that heightened projection. Right. But there's going to be more of a percentage of time where she can win you a tournament, because it's that one game or two where that leverage can be so huge, because you jump the entire field and she directly gets all the minutes that the other player was going to get. And she performs at a fantasy point per minute. So it's a huge difference. And telling all the people those examples and talking about the rotations, that's why those things are so key.
Awesome. Well, it was a lot of fun talking to you. I will, as soon as we hop off, first of all, get Matt in the Discord, get a WNBA channel opened up. That's been overdue already, so we can have some conversations continue over there. If you are hanging out with us here on this live stream, or you happen to catch the recording later, and you're interested in checking out these projections, they're up every single WNBA slate on SaberSim now here. We have a free 5-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. You can come in, check out the projections for WNBA for 5 days, and get access to all of our other sports as well. So, Matt, one last time, I really appreciate you coming on here and chatting to me. It was a lot of fun, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, man. Looking forward to it. Y'all have a good one.
All right. Thanks, everyone.